Good morning. Welcome to this character writing workshop from my home and my first major workshop in virtual space, which is challenging, but I'm so thankful we have this great technology. I want to thank the folks at the Gaithersburg Book Festival for helping me set this up and inviting me to participate with you in writing about characters and making them come to life. My name is Ginger Brookover. I live in wild, wonderful West Virginia. I taught speech communication for over 2.5 decades at Fairmont State University. And I have conducted some workshops, including a former Gaithersburg Book Festival workshop. And I love sharing lots of ideas I have about storytelling that I implemented in my classroom through the years. I required all my students to introduce topics for speeches with the beginning of a story. Then at the end of their speech, they came to the conclusion, what happened to that young man who was going blind and was with his father in the kitchen at the time he had received the diagnosis. So storytelling is a great tool for getting people to identify with characters. And before I get started with details about making characters come alive, if you're using an iPad today, and we're going to get to a point where there's an opportunity for you to participate, if you want to participate, you'll need to bring up the toolbar or the raised hand bar by tapping your iPad screen or wiggling your mouse. You should see a bar that'll have a raised hand. And when you tap on that or click on that, you can participate. I will address you by name at that time. It'll be within the next half hour, 35 minutes or so. We'll start doing the participation portion of the workshop. You're welcome to take notes if you'd like. Obviously, this is a very relaxed setting. And if you just want to listen and glean information that I have to share with you, that's great too. During the participation part of the workshop, you may want to have a piece of pencil and paper, of course not, piece of paper and a pencil, a little tongue twister there, to jot down just a note or two. And we'll come back to that later on because I'll ask a series of questions and then I'll say, okay, question number 3, and I'll read that. And if you want to participate, say, this is how I respond. This is how I could use this information in formulating a character. So hopefully you'll find your raised hand bar, the raised hand symbol, and we're set to go. First of all, let me ask you to contemplate something. Oh, I'm supposed to tell you my credentials. Okay, I already told you I taught for about 2.5 decades in the field of communication studies. I was awarded an outstanding faculty member recognition, and I retired in 2009 to travel, which is kind of the quintessential stereotype for old ladies. And I've really, really enjoyed my retirement, including the opportunity to do some writing that I never seemed to find time for when I was teaching or taking care of family, and I have family to take care of as well. May I preface this first by saying, if you remember the scene in Steel Magnolias where the father goes out to the lawn and there are all these birds tweeting and screeching, and he has a shotgun, I'm pretty sure it was a shotgun, and he's blasting it into the trees. We have barn swallows coming in on the porch. My husband's already been out this morning with the shotgun and balloons, which he has been popping repeatedly to try to get rid of the birds. I have it on good authority that that's not going to happen in the next hour. But if you should hear any shotgun blasts in the background, do not call 911, do not go past go, do not collect $200. It's just us trying to scare off barn swallows. And if you're an animal activist and you think that's just outrageous and outlandish, it was funny in a movie, but it's not funny in reality, please be rest assured, he can't hit those birds. He couldn't hit them with a cannon if he wanted to. They're fleeting, they're fast, and it's just kind of funny. If you have a solution to barn swallow, invasion, please send me an email. By the way, send me an email if you have any questions or want to give me any feedback personally to ginger.brookover@gmail.com. So, my books I've written. I started out with an 8-year endeavor to collect information to create my first historic novel called Storm Path. This is based on the deadliest tornado in the history of the United States. It's also based on real experiences of my grandmother living on a farm here in northern West Virginia. And some children were going to school when a tornado touched down, which is pretty rare for this area. And I collected enough information. One little girl ran off into the storm, and the part 2 of the book has to do with what happened to that little girl. How did the children respond? They were by themselves on a dirt road, nobody taking care of them. So Storm Path was my first venture into writing. And it's very personal because it happened to my mom and her brothers and sisters, my grandmother. And it started actually in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri. So I traveled to the Ozark Mountains and began my research there. And I found the grave of the first man who was killed in the storm, who was a farmer in Missouri. So this was my first endeavor. I learned a lot in the process and came along and decided I really like things like Alfred Hitchcock movies. I love Sue Grafton's Kinsey Millhone series. I think I am Kinsey Millhone. Sue Grafton said she thought she was Kinsey Millhone, but I may be a little bit closer. I love Agatha Christie, that kind of storytelling entrances me. So I decided I want to go with murders. I grew up loving The Twilight Zone, Alfred Hitchcock, One Step Beyond, and those kinds of shows. So I put together my first murder set in Washington, D.C., and the folks down at Politics and Prose put this together for me. It's called Capital Murder Imbroglio. And I was real pleased with some of the feedback I got from readers who, one reader called me on the phone, a gentleman I go to church with, we're not good friends, but we're acquaintances. And he yelled at me for 45 minutes over the phone and said, I didn't see it coming. I didn't see it coming. And I thought, yes, I'm so glad you didn't see it coming. And to this day, we still laugh about it a lot. Putting that twist at the end of the story where characters are concerned. And I'll probably come back to that too. My current book available through Politics and Prose is Murder on Black Bear Mountain. Black Bear Mountain is a fictitious mountain, but it is set in the real Monongahela National Forest. And I'm well aware of what some of the dangers are in the forest. But in 2009, there was an interesting news story that I've never been able to get out of my head. It involved the death of a person in a way that I've never heard before. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I wonder if that was an accidental death or if it was murder. And couldn't it have been murder? So I took that real news story, that's your first clue, go to the newspapers, go to current events, go to dated events, find something that intrigues you, and then spin it into fiction. You can research the real story, and I don't discourage you from doing that, but this is fiction. It didn't happen. Gladys is not real. But it's also based on a whole composite of ideas about people. A lot of us, when we retire, we have these great aspirations about how we're going to spend retirement. And the idea of having a log cabin in the mountains, in the Monongahela National Forest, living in nature and living out the rest of your life in a natural setting sounds so romantic and exciting. But in reality, I realized as I was writing it, if I lived in a cabin in the mountains in the Monongahela National Forest, I would be scared to death, to be isolated. And isolation is a key variable that it affects characters and people in the real world. So that's my peddling for today. I encourage you to read one or all three and contact me if you'd like more information. Certainly contact Politics and Prose. Gaithersburg Book Festival has a link to order books for participants. So let's talk about characters. Well, I'm going to talk about characters. You're going to listen for a little bit. Think about this. We know Atticus Finch, Juliet, Capulet, Jack Reacher, Superman, Sherlock Holmes, Tom Robinson, Mary Poppins, Huckleberry Finn, Miss Marple, and so many more. Now, what's the thing that's really unique and common when I say those names? First of all, they're not people at all, but we tend to think of them as being someone we know, someone we can identify with, someone who might be our next door neighbor or might be somebody in passing. But the uniqueness of having named those kinds of characters is that they're not real, they're not people, they're not even names. They're words on paper that we interpret as characters, and the characters are people in our minds. I can identify with Scout Finch. I climbed trees. I was a tomboy. I had a brother who drove me crazy. And the uniqueness of a good writer to develop people from paper is what we're addressing today. I've already mentioned point number one. Here's what you can do if you want to come up with characters. First of all, it's really important to do good research. One of the ways you can get information about an era that where you did not live, 1925, I don't know anything about that storm. I had to go to the library. I had to interview people. I started in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri, and I went to every public library and every historical society I could find, from Missouri all the way back to West Virginia, to get information for my first book. Here's an old newspaper clipping I bought up from one of my grade school scrapbooks. Yes, I was alive when President Kennedy was assassinated. I'm that old. But newspapers are a great resource for developing authentic characters and putting them in an authentic setting. If you have the entire newspaper, you can go through and look at advertisements for various products and how much products cost. Not only do I recommend newspapers as a source of information, there are news magazines and other credible sources that might come in handy. This is a 1980 issue of Newsweek magazine during the time of the Ted Kennedy, Jimmy Carter contentious rivalry for the presidential nomination. There's so much information in this Newsweek magazine that will get you to that place, get you to who these people were and what was going on at the time. But the strange thing for me, when I pulled out that old magazine that I looked at that gave perspective I had forgotten, was the advertisements for cigarettes. Look at this ad. We have a beautiful woman on a 2-page full spread center of the magazine ad. This was a huge expense for cigarette companies. The magazine is full of cigarettes and alcohol. And notably, a lot of news magazines and popular publications, with the exception of Good Housekeeping, had not only cigarette ads and alcohol ads, but they used the back cover, which is a critical place in terms of marketing, to put materials. But I could sit down and read this entire Newsweek magazine and have an excellent perspective on what was happening at the time. If you're a Sue Grafton fan and you've read, pardon me, I'm going to make some adjustments here on my screen. I apologize for doing this. There we go. Sue Grafton's books start and proceed chronologically. But if you look at the content, there's a lot of information about what was going on in the media at that time. And so she works Kinsey Millhone into the era, the experiences of that time. Even things like a drought in California comes to mind when I think about Kinsey Millhone and her landlord, Henry, and his efforts to address the drought with recycled water, gray water, and that sort of thing. It's all integrated into the story to give it perspective based on what's happening historically. So I recommend newspapers, I recommend news magazines as a starter. If you want to write about the current COVID pandemic, and by the way, I hope you're all doing well, and certainly the current civil rights contention and concerns, which take me straight back to the 60s. I remember the assassination of President Kennedy, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, and everything that transpired socially in that era. And yet, if I were to write a story in that era, I would still go back to news magazines and publications at that time to refresh my memory, to make sure that my perspective hasn't altered over time. So even if you're writing fiction and you're writing fictitious characters, it's important to make sure that you have a balanced, realistic perspective of who these people are in that era. Probably the most critical piece of fiction that I think of in terms of understanding the culture of the time and the place is To Kill a Mockingbird, and Harper Lee's account of the trial of Tom Robinson in conjunction with Atticus Finch's relationship to his children, to his community, and his role as a defense attorney. So newspapers, great place to start to get ideas. My book, I mentioned Murder on Black Bear Mountain, actually was inspired by a true story that was in the news in 2009. That's been a few years ago, and it just stuck with me until I thought, I'm going to spin this into a murder. And I've had pretty good feedback too from my readers on that. I apologize, I get a little dry while I'm talking, so I'm going to sip my Diet Coke as I always did in the classroom to make sure I don't get my grandma's voice here. You know, I love listening to Dr. Anthony Fauci, but he has the most scratchy voice, and I'm going to come back to that too in terms of characterization. But I'm really concerned about his vocal quality. But as we get older, things do change, we know that. So I'm going to go through a whole list of ideas about ways to develop characters and where to draw information that makes them jump off the page and stay with the reader. The first thing, number one, you can use real life people as a basis for characters in your stories. And I'm talking predominantly about fiction here, but nonfiction applies too, and I'll get to that in a moment. At the end of his life, John Updike wrote a poem titled Peggy Lutz, Fred Muth. I hope I pronounced them correctly. But the purpose of that poem was to acknowledge his childhood friends. And he referred to them as the beauty, the bully, the fatso, and others because they provide sufficient human types for all writers and for everything a writer would need. That comes from a gentleman called J.R. Benjamin, who wrote about Updike's poem and the implications where writing characters are concerned. Please be very careful. If you use real life people as a model for your stories, you don't want to get yourself into a situation where you're accused of libel, defamation, causing somebody emotional distress. And it does happen. John Grisham has been sued more than once, and at one point he was sued for defamation. And it was based on his book, The Innocent Man. Prosecuting attorney and a law enforcement officer in Oklahoma sued him on the basis of a case where a young waitress had been murdered, and the two men who were convicted of that murder ultimately were exonerated after several years in prison. When The Innocent Man came out, the prosecuting attorney in that case and this law enforcement officer sued Grisham for defamation and causing emotional distress. The case went to court and the judge dismissed it. So that was the end of the suit, except for appeals court. The claimants filed an appeal to a higher court, and they upheld the dismissal of the lawsuit as not having merit. Likewise, John Grisham was sued for plagiarism, which I'll mention here too, because you want to be careful if you're getting into a real life situation. Somebody's already written a book about it. Be sure that you're either citing your sources and or you're not defaming anybody, or it could not possibly be construed that you were intent on libeling another person. The American Bar Association Journal published a piece, several other publications did, with regard to the innocent man lawsuit, defamation lawsuit against Grisham. Pardon me, I beg your pardon. They wrote about that too, but there was an attorney who worked for Ted Bundy as his last legal counsel, who had written a book. Her name was, and of course I can't see it at the moment, plagiarism, Polly Nelson. Polly Nelson wrote a book titled Defending the Devil, My Story as Ted Bundy's Last Lawyer, which sounds fascinating. She claimed that Grisham's book, The Chamber, had plagiarized her writing with regard to the Bundy case. That went to court, and in turn, that case was dismissed as well. And I got that information from the Tampa Bay Times article in 1977. I have a theory, and my theory is maybe we don't want to be as well established as authors as we think we do, because you acquire fame, you acquire money, and the next thing you know, somebody's out to get you. But writing is a precarious responsibility, among other things. So we absolutely must be careful not to defame anybody. I am not an attorney, but I have read and heard, and I think I read a Grisham quote that once somebody dies, then the doors open up for saying anything you want to about that person, using their name, whatever, and their heirs have no say about it. But I strongly encourage you, if you have any questions at all about the appropriateness of using a dead person's name in fiction or nonfiction as well, that you confer with an attorney and make sure you're on track. I was trying to think, one of my books, I did contact an intellectual property rights attorney. I think it was Stormpath, because I used so many newspaper articles, but I modeled the writing after Loving Frank, if you're familiar with that book, which is historical fiction. I believe that's the category, and I could be wrong about the genre. And I did seek legal counsel before I presumed to use anybody's name or infer anything about someone, particularly once they're gone. And I'm not saying that's a license to be unkind. I'm just saying that the rules change. But when people are alive, if there's any possibility that you have modeled a character after real people, then consider liability concerns and consider the ethics of doing anything that would inadvertently or intentionally defame someone. Oh, I apologize. I meant to make a note of this. The author who wrote The Yearling, Rawlings, had written a nonfiction book. And I believe the name of the book was The Cabin. I forgot to write down the notations, but she was sued by her neighbors who lived in Florida, out in the swamps of Florida, in which I have visited. I visited Rawlings' home. And they sued her for defamation, and they prevailed in court, unlike Grisham. And the author was acknowledged with the Pulitzer Prize for her contribution, and yet her reputation was sort of sullied by the fact that these people were very distressed, apparently were very distressed, by the way she portrayed them in her nonfiction book. So be extremely careful about designing characters in fiction or nonfiction, particularly if the people are alive, but even if they're not alive, consider the ethics of changing things. when I wrote Storm Path, I did confer with people who lived in that era, my mother and her siblings being among them. And I tried to compile a good representation of what happened to the children on the road. And then, of course, I went to the Ozark Mountains and I traveled by car all the way back along the path of the storm. This was the deadliest storm in the history of the United States of its type, deadliest tornado. The path was 219 miles long, which is the longest path. It crossed the Mississippi River. It went into Illinois, went across the state of Illinois, crossed the Wabash River, and into Indiana. Phenomenal meteorological event. Dr. Greg Forbes said it's 1 in 1,000 years that this kind of event occurs. But it's interesting, in 1925, the newspapers wrote in great detail about the deaths of people. Today we say there were 3 fatalities in a tornado in Mississippi or wherever. And excuse me, I'm going to ask my toolman to give me a cough drop because I'm already having problems. Excuse me. And after I wrote it, I had one reader that said, what did the families think of you putting in there that a child was decapitated or dismembered or impaled? In fact, Jim Cantori asked me, how do you know these children were impaled? Where did you get this information? And I said, in 1925, the newspapers of that era printed everything, every detail that was possible, including how the child died, how old the child was, and what the child's name was. And even Cantori was kind of surprised, I think, by that fact. So everything I put in the book represented a strong approximation of exactly what transpired. So it's based, and here's the other problem too. If you've done any work at all where you're citing newspapers, a lot of times the newspapers don't get it right. And they make mistakes. In fact, I do remember from that story and from that research that one little 2-year-old girl was buried and the family was told that she had been killed by the storm. And they grieved and went to the funeral. In fact, the child was not properly identified and she was alive. Somebody had found her close to their property and taken her in to take care of her. She was too young to identify her parents, her family, her home. And they just had to wait until they could get her back to the proper family. This family buried someone else's child, and that's a fact. But it is an indication that in the midst of a crisis, in the midst of a disaster, all kinds of mistakes are made. And it's one of the things that a solid journalist works diligently to prevent, if at all possible. And even so, mistakes happen. Well, another favorite author of mine in terms of character creation is Agatha Christie. And I'm going to be citing Richard Norton Taylor, Agatha Christie's investigated mysteries. Oh, writing about real people. In 1941, one of Christie's books came out in which one of her characters was named Major Bletchley. During World War II, there was a military intelligence base at a place called Bletchley Park. The intention of that park and the people who worked there was to decode the German information for purposes of protecting, obviously, the British Isles. And her details in her characters were so specific, and you do want to be specific at developing characters, but MI5 started investigating Agatha Christie, believing that she had acquired information that was classified information. She did have a friend at Bletchley Park. So they went to her friend and said, can you tell me, see what you can find out about what she knows? Has she been tapping into classified information? Because we need to address this. The security of our nation is at stake here. And they simply found out that she had taken a train. She was taking a train from Oxford back to London. And the train stopped at Bletchley Park, and she was held up in her travels, and it was apparently frustrating for her. And I'll give you a quote. In response to the inquiry about whether or not she had classified information simply because she named one of her characters Bletchley, she said, quote, "My dear, I was stuck there on my way by train from Oxford to London and took revenge by giving the name to one of my least lovable characters." That's all there was to it. She didn't have information. She didn't have classified information. But these kinds of questions do come up. The late Tom Clancy, very renowned author, was suspected of being under investigation by the FBI for a lot of details in his writing. And it was rumored for a long time that he was under investigation, perhaps for violating national security, for obtaining classified information through sources, pardon me. But in fact, after he died, now here's the interesting thing. The Baltimore Sun was able to file a Freedom of Information Act request to access FBI files about Clancy. They would not have had access to them prior to that time. And when they obtained them, the FBI had done a background check on Clancy, but it was simply because he had been offered a position at the White House as part of the Space Force because of his name recognition, to promote continued work in outer space and NASA and that sort of thing. And the FBI does all kinds of inquiries before they hire somebody. I don't believe Clancy ever took that position. He did have contacts in the White House, but there's no evidence that I can find that he violated any national security or any classified information whatsoever. Those who love Clancy suspect that he had too much information. In fact, I think I read some of Clancy several years ago. I believe he has one plot, if I'm not mistaken, where he foreshadowed the events of 9/11, which I think kind of creeped him out as well, that he had some expectation that there was something disastrous that could happen. So again, be very careful of your sources of information. And if you're going to model a character after a real life person and real life events, think carefully and consult with somebody else to be sure, am I defaming anybody here? Am I committing libel? Are there plagiarism issues? And is it ethical? And the one thing we emphasize now in my field is it doesn't matter if something's legal. If it's not ethical, don't do it. Now you have to decide, and there are some standards of what constitutes ethical conduct on the part of writers, but be very careful. Now, Dean Koontz, according to a Writer's Digest article, said that the first thing we want to do with a character is plunge them into trouble as fast as we can, as soon as we can. And that piques the reader's interest. And there's been so much emphasis in recent years to do that on the first page, or at least in the first chapter. It's the hook. And it has something to do with somebody, in most cases, that we look up to. One of the ways to describe a person, place, or thing that is absolutely fundamental is to use an observation about the five senses. So let me touch briefly on that. Sense of taste. Sue Grafton. The investigator Kinsey Milhone has something in her behavior that most of us can identify with, if not now, at some point in our life. She loved McDonald's quarter pounders with cheese. With cheese, not just a quarter pounder. Very specific. It keeps showing up in these recurring stories. And we begin to relate to Kinsey as somebody like, yeah, I've been on the road. I love to travel. I love to write, among other things. And I love to investigate through the libraries, characters and real historic events. And many a time I've driven to a fast food restaurant for something to eat. So that little nuance adds reality to this notion of who was Kinsey Milhone. Sense of touch. In Bill Bryson's book, The Body, I love the fact that he points out that if a loved one caresses us, and so many of us are touch deprived during this pandemic, and thank goodness I have a very affectionate husband here who I can hug all I want, but a lot of my single friends who are living alone are just having an extremely difficult time. Touch is absolutely fundamentally important in our lives. Bryson points out that if a lover or a family member embraces us, touches us, caresses us, it's a good feeling. It's a wonderful feeling. It's perfectly natural. On the other hand, if a stranger comes up to you and grabs you or hugs you and you don't know who they are, or if they're sweaty, or whatever it is that repulses you, the reaction is entirely different. So you can use all kinds of references to touch as a way of creating connection with your audience, be it good touch or bad. And I guess as a woman, I've been pretty lucky most of my life, but I have had a few moments where somebody, a guy, you know, would hug me or kiss me or something, and it's like, ew, that's really kind of creepy, which means you're kind of creepy. And don't think I can't spin that into a character, because I can. As far as sight is concerned, the doors are wide open, the possibilities are huge. But let me, if I may, read to you a description by Mark Twain of Huckleberry Finn. You may want to close your eyes or you can take notes, but try to visualize this. Huckleberry was always dressed in cast-off clothes of full-grown men, and they were in perennial bloom and fluttering with rags. His hat was a vast ruin with a wide crescent lopped out of its brim. His coat, when he wore one, hung nearly to his heels and had the rearward buttons far down the back, but one suspender supported his trousers. The seat of his trousers bagged low and contained nothing. The fringed legs dragged in the dirt when not rolled up. Barefoot in the spring, he never had to wash nor put on clean clothes. Can you see Huckleberry Finn? I know Huckleberry Finn. I was a barefoot kid growing up in the country. I wore hand-me-down clothes. Some of them didn't fit very well. I was a tomboy climbing trees. I can see him. But keep in mind, it's not a person. It's not a real person. It never has been. It's not even a real name. It's just the description that makes us feel like we know this character. I'm going to wrap up here with the sense of sound. And I have a couple of examples that may illustrate how you can get this on paper so that it has an impact. I had an English professor many, many years ago, I think it was a literature class. I never forgot his description of Rod Stewart's voice. He loved Rod Stewart. And when he described Stewart's voice to me, it made perfect sense as a metaphor. He said Rod Stewart's singing sounded like sandpaper rubbed on a microphone. It's so descriptive. It's like, dear Dr. Fauci's voice. I'm really kind of worried about his voice, but it's very distinct. And when you hear it, I was so impressed that Brad Pitt did such a great job emulating Dr. Fauci. He did it beautifully. But Rod Stewart's sandpaper on a microphone, I can never forget that. I can never get that image out of my head. And Laura De Silverio, in an article called 8 Ways to Make Your Character Sound Distinctive, wrote about Jack Reacher and simply quoted, Reacher said nothing. Not only is sound important, the absence of sound speaks volumes. And finally, before we jump into the workshop part of the class, the sense of smell. How do you communicate that on paper? smell anything in a book, except the book itself. If it's an antique book, even a new book has this distinct odor. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Shakespeare. The problem with this reference at this day and age, when I was in high school, way back in the 60s, when my boyfriend, now my husband, bought me roses, I could smell them. When you buy roses today, they are absent of smell, and I'm not sure why, but it probably has something to do with preservatives. I don't know that, but you can't smell roses anymore. Either that or my nose has calmed down on me, and I don't think that's it, because I can smell a lot of stuff. Ask my husband when he comes in from sweating and mowing the grass. But I like the fact that Laurel Bush pointed out on medium.com a mistake that people make when they're describing sounds in literature sometimes. You got to know what you're talking about. You have to know what the scents are. She had read a romance novel in which the heroine of a historical romance weaves marigolds into her hair, and she bathes in marigold soap. And marigold was her signature scent. Now that sounds fine and dandy and very descriptive. The problem is marigolds stink to high heaven if you've ever put them out. People plant them along their garden's edge to keep out pests because they emit such an offensive odor. Marigolds are not something anybody with any olfactory sense whatsoever would weave through their hair, and certainly wouldn't bathe in it. They stink. So if you're going to describe a character by smell, then you need to know the smell. By the way, I can almost smell Huckleberry Finn because he didn't bathe. Ever. And I've smelled those people. And it's overwhelming. And I've smelled kids who need scrubbed down. I've always said, I'd like to take a wire brush to that guy. He stinks to high heaven. And watch out for the cliches too, in spite of the fact. The last point I want to bring up is pay attention to people around you. Agatha Christie used to go out in public with notebooks. She always had a notebook with her and a pen or pencil. I don't know which it was. Don't recall specifically. And she just paid attention to people who are out there. And please be careful with the social distancing things now. Observing people in public is difficult to do. But I did a story a few years ago about people in a food court. And I looked around and I could assign an animal identity to all of them. So there were cows in the food court, there were pigs in the food court, there were chickens in the food court, and they were all behaving in ways that one could liken to animals. So then I just changed them all into animals, kind of like Animal Farm. Christie, by the way, used her step-grandmother as a model for Miss Marple. And she also used some of her imaginary characters from childhood, some of her imaginary friends, to shape her novels. And the reason she used her grandmother as a model for Miss Marple in particular was a personality trait where her grandmother was very sweet, and she had no unkindness for anyone, and neither did Miss Marple. Just a dear little old lady, except she did not trust people. Hercule Poirot was fashioned after Christie's interaction with Belgian refugees during World War II. And that was very deliberate on her part. She had some experience, and she had experience with people that had that distinct dialect, and maybe some people with specific mannerisms, and that became the model for Poirot. I have a lot more to share, but I'd like to give you a chance to participate in the minutes we have left. If you have your pencil and paper, we'll see how this goes and try to finish up at 11:30, 11:35. But I'd like you to finish these prompts as you think about who are my characters, what do they look like, what do they sound like, and by the way, what is the setting where they are? Because the setting defines who a character is. So finish this, please. first thing that comes to your mind. This is like a Rorschach for writers. My favorite grade school teacher never failed to what? Number 2, I was betrayed by a guy who, and use action words, do not use adjectives. He might have been a jerk, but what did he do that said he was a jerk? Number 3, nothing scares me more than the fear of being isolated in the woods on a mountaintop with no cell phone service. I've been to that mountaintop and I didn't have cell phone service, and it's exhilarating and it's great to get back to civilization. Number 4, I admire people who do what? Who are the people you admire? What do they do? Not a description of they're great philanthropists, but specifically, what specific behavior? Are they going to soup kitchens? Excuse me, I'm giving you ideas here. The ideas for you to come up with ideas. Number 5, I am most vulnerable when I'm alone in the mountains, in the forest, without cell phone signal, and there's some weird guys going down the road in a pickup truck with bear dogs in the back of it. Yeah, and I've been there too. It's scary. It's scary. And I feel like I'm alone. They can figure this out. I'm pretty vulnerable. I apologize. I just filled in the blank again. Okay. What time is it here? It's 11:20. We have about 10 minutes left. Let's start with those 5 and see if we have any participation. Oh, I see a raised hand. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Hina? Let's see what Hina has to say. And I'd specifically like to hear about those 5 prompts. What would you
I'm sorry, it wasn't about the 5 prompts.
That's okay.
This was a question that I had.
Okay.
I'm writing a story about a real life Chief Justice of the colonial Supreme Court of Delaware. His ghost. He died, and actually his ghost started to haunt Dover, which is the capital of Delaware. So in this story, I attribute all kinds of actions to that ghost. Is that okay to do?
Certainly. I certainly believe it is quite okay. It sounds intriguing. Just in that short description, you piqued my interest. I like ghost stories. I like ghost stories too. Yeah. This clearly is someone who is not alive, so you don't have to worry about any of those.
That is true. However, his son later on became one of the justices in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. So the chances are that he has a distinguished family, and his descendants are still around and doing very well.
Yeah.
So is it still okay? I mean, he doesn't do bad stuff. His ghost does good stuff, and even hooks up with another female ghost. Is that all right to do that?
I believe it is, personally. This is a judgment call where ethics are concerned. If you have some reservations and you have any lines of communication with his family, you just might run it past them. When I wrote Storm Path, I inserted the name Jim Cantori, a real life figure as we know. But before I put it in the book, before it was published, I contacted Jim and said, would it be okay if I put you in the book? And there's nothing disparaging about your representation at all. It's just the journalist is out on the road and somebody says, if you see Jim Cantori, you're in trouble. Something like that. And I contacted him directly because I wanted to be sure it was okay to use his name. He got back to me and I had it in writing that he approved of his name in the book.
The problem with that is that there are so many descendants. There's no one particular person that I could contact, and I'm not using anybody's name. I'm using the ghost of that Supreme Court justice who died.
Yeah.
you know, I'm not using anybody else's name. Is that?
I think it's perfectly all right, and especially given the tone that you're writing with. I'd say go ahead and do it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
That sounds great. Great story. Let's go to Diane. Diane.
Hi, sorry, I had to unmute. Okay, so to your 4 questions, I think they were.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was something that you're really afraid of.
Right.
I am terrified, even now, all these years later, of taking a shower in the house if I'm alone. I mean, if
Psycho.
they're 20 house, I'll take a shower, but if I'm in the house alone, I can't get over it. You know where that comes from.
Psycho.
Yes.
Yes. Let me tell you something. You are not alone. Actually, it was Janet Leigh that played in that, correct?
Yes, Janet Leigh, right.
I love Hitchcock. I love Hitchcock.
Yeah, I did
And
too.
do you know that after she did that movie, she would not take a shower with a curtain? I think her curtains had to be open. You are not alone. And you can spin
or
that.
Transparent. Have to have shower curtains that are transparent. You can see through them.
Yeah, I've traveled all over the United States alone, and I'm telling you, I am so guarded. I have alarms that I slide under the door of my bathroom that will trigger anybody touching that door.
Yeah.
So, boy, spin that into a character, to a real dangerous situation, or an imagined situation where somebody's just paranoid because they saw a movie. And you can play on that and spin it to create something new beyond Psycho that we all can relate to. And I'm telling you, you can definitely reel in.
I can work with that.
Readers, absolutely. I love it.
My other one was that I admire people pretty much like myself. I admire people who are good conversationalists. I could sit and listen to them forever. I don't run into too many people like that, but if a person is a real good conversationalist, I will forget everything I have to do the rest of the day and just talk and listen and talk and listen.
Yeah, that was part of my teaching requirement too, was to get people to learn how to exchange information without monopolizing. I would take that a step further. It's not just that they're good conversationalists. That's the label you put on them. Okay. What makes them a good conversationalist? And one of the attributes is they ask about you. What do you like? What are you interested in? How do you feel? Where are you with the pandemic? Or whatever's important to you. And they identify what your concerns and your interests are. So I would try to hone that so that it's more specific to what they say and how they say it. Even when I put this program together, I've learned to look at the camera lens on my iPad instead of looking at the screen. Because if I look at the screen, this is what you see. If I look at the camera lens, it appears that I'm making eye contact with you, even though, of course, we're so far away. Yeah. But eye contact is a very, very important part of communication process interpersonally. So I would pin that down to things much more specific than just saying they're great conversationalists. Sit back and look at the people that you love to talk to, and then look at the people that you just can't get a word in edgeways, or they're so boring, or they're always talking about their car or whatever. But be very
people
specific.
That I find interesting to talk to tend to be people who share things that I don't know. Okay, like you are sharing something I don't know. I could talk to you forever. People who I sit down and talk with, they'll go, oh, you know, last week I went to this place and I am learning about something I had no idea. So I love talking to people who share what I don't know.
Yeah, that's much more specific. And then you can even get right down to an example of that. I'm drawing a blank at the moment, but, well, when I went to Missouri to research my first book, I could sit and listen to the historians at the historical societies for hours, because they had all of the resources, all of the microfiche, all of the details. And I made an interesting discovery historically that nobody, to my knowledge, with the exception of a few people in Illinois, knew about the role. And I'll go ahead and give away the big surprise, a little bit of a spoiler, that Charles Lindbergh played in that storm in 1925. And it is a powerful, powerful disclosure. I called the Smithsonian Institute and called the Air and Space Museum. And I found a curator who specializes in the history of Charles Lindbergh, who is the quintessential expert on Lindbergh. And he never heard
it.
That
See?
Lindbergh was involved. And it just, I've got goosebumps now just thinking about it. And that's the joy of doing that kind of research and meeting those kinds of people. So I understand that. And just, you know, again, identify characters that you don't like to talk to and characters that are just a joy, and why. Sit down and put them side by side on paper and say, he does this, she does that, and then develop new characters for a story based on those attributes. Plus, again, it's like the Psycho incident. You'd be surprised how many women have seen that movie, and maybe some guys too. I've never heard a guy say he was afraid to take a shower, but nevertheless. And you can use humor, whatever. Thank you very much for that question. We are officially out of time. So I want to thank you all for being here. I hope I gave you a few ideas. I have many, many, many more. I'm too long-winded for the amount of time I have. It's always been a problem of mine. I have way too much information. But go with some of these thoughts and ask yourself some hypothetical questions. The other questions I had was, the biggest jerk I ever knew was someone who, the one place in the world I'd like to visit is where? Because the scariest movie I've ever seen. And by the way, Psycho's close to the top. I had read that Stephen King's scariest movie is Wait Until Dark. Oh, I love Wait Until Dark. Another question, when someone seems crazy, I always respond by doing what? If my family were threatened, I would do what? I feel helpless when I am at peace when. My favorite literary character is blank because I love Kinsey Millhone. She's just great. She's average, she has flaws, she has faults, but she is smart and she is courageous. If I had 3 wishes that could be granted, I would wish for A, B, C. Make them into 3 different characters. Put them in a story. And finally, something I know about myself that no one else knows is that, last comment I'll leave with you, if you use yourself as a character, be very, very careful. There's this concept of self-disclosure that works very positively among conversationalists, by the way. But if we over-disclose, you know that popular saying, too much information? There's a line we don't want to cross. So I genuinely discourage people from being very highly disclosive, which is considered deviant behavior, but being moderately disclosure in order to win over your readers, if you're modeling after yourself. Excuse me. I'm out of my voice and I'm out of time. Good luck with your writing. Thanks for joining me. Take care and be safe.